Welcome to the second video we are doing here at Ubi Petrus. Our first article was in reply to Erick Ybarra, who erroneously claimed that the Tome of Leo was ex-cathedra, and there was a short exchange of articles, which can be found in the links below. It is now almost exactly 1 year since it was published, and since it is one of the most viewed articles, we decided to expand on that and make a video discussing the topic in much greater detail. Though there are some quotations and sound clips from Mr. Ybarra detailing the defense of his view that the tome is ex-cathedra, it is enough to know that he holds this view. As a significant amount of work, time, and materials go into these videos, your support is greatly appreciated. It allows us to create more content like this and to create it at much more regular intervals. The first half of this video will be available on YouTube, while the entire video will be available to subscribers on Patreon for at least a period of time for a small payment. Shortly after that, we will post the script to this video on the website www.ubipetrusibiEcclesia.com for those who would prefer to read it. According to the First Vatican Council, quote, "Therefore, faithfully adhering to the tradition received from the beginning of the Christian religion, for the glory of God our Savior, for the exaltation of the Catholic faith, and the salvation of the Christian people, with the approval of the Sacred Council, we teach and define that it is a divinely revealed dogma that the Roman Pontiff, when he speaks ex cathedra, in other words, when exercising his office as pastor and teacher of all Christians, he defines by his supreme apostolic authority a doctrine of faith or morals which must be held by the universal church, enjoys, through the divine assistance, that infallibility promised to him in Blessed Peter, and with which the divine Redeemer wanted his church to be endowed in defining doctrine of faith or morals, and therefore, that the definitions of the same Roman Pontiff are irreformable of themselves, and not from the consent of the Church. If anyone should presume to contradict this definition of ours, may God prevent that happening, anathema sit." End quote. So ends the fourth chapter of Vatican I's dogmatic constitution, Pastor Aeternus, stating that the Roman Catholic Pope can, at his pleasure, bind the Church to dogmatic decrees without the consent of the worldwide episcopate. But the Pope, we are told by Catholic apologists, could not do this on a whim, and that if he did decree something against the deposit of faith, the faithful are not obliged to obey it, and the bishops could depose him, or so they claim. Of course, this then begs the question of what, quote, "not from the consent of the Church," end quote, means, if one can simply ignore pronouncements from the Pope when he intends to bind. It also begs the question of what exactly is the point of a Pope who can speak infallibly and without the consent of the Church, if even a layman can out-interpret the Pope in matters of faith and morals. A traditionalist might say, well, it's easy, simply look at previous magisterial documents. But this is the same logic as sola scriptura, and simply rebounds back to the second question. What then is the point of having an infallible Pope who can speak without the consent of the Church if even a layman can out-interpret him? But we are in luck, because at the First Vatican Council, in order to make sure no such confusion could or would take place, one bishop was specifically tasked by Pope Pius IX to produce a document clarifying exactly what is meant by Pastor Aeternus, and this work was then ratified by the Council en toto as the official interpretation of Vatican I's fourth chapter of Pastor Aeternus. This work, commonly known as Bishop Gasser's Relatio, is formally known among the Council documents as the Official Relatio on Infallibility of Bishop Vincent Gasser at Vatican Council I. For the purposes of this video, we are using the translation and commentary by Father James T. O'Connor, published by the Daughters of St. Paul in 1986, and possessing both a nihil obstat and imprimatur, and thereby has been approved as a document containing no heresy. This was the first translation of the Relatio made, and it bears the name, the Gift of Infallibility. In his translation and commentary to it, Father O'Connor makes clear the importance of the Relatio, stating, quote, "Central to all the discussions on the meaning of papal infallibility as Vatican I defined it, has been the official presentation, the Relatio, made by Bishop Vincent Ferrer Gasser to the General Congregation of Bishops of Vatican I, which took place on July the 11th, 1870." End quote. Father O'Connor follows this by saying, quote, "So important is the Relatio of Gasser that it has itself become a theological source, cited in innumerable manuals and theological treatments, and serving even in our own times as a key element in the renewed theological discussions about infallibility. Indeed, the Second Vatican Council, in its dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, cites Gasser's Relatio 4 times in its important chapter on the magisterium or teaching office of Pope and bishops. Paragraph number 25 has approximately only 55 lines of text and 8 official footnotes. Thus, half of the citations in that key section of Vatican II's Lumen Gentium are to Gasser's Relatio." End quote. He then goes on to state, quote, "The deputation then entrusted to Gasser the task of relaying its recommendations and of giving an official explanation of the meaning of the amended draft, so that the bishops would know precisely what they were voting on when they came to approve or reject the proposed Chapter 4 of Pastor Aeternus. It is in this aspect of his task that the importance of Gasser's Relatio can be discerned. It is the key to proper interpretation of Chapter 4 of Pastor Aeternus, as it was finally approved since the bishops voted on it, as explained by Gasser representing the Deputation de Fide." End quote. With this in mind, it is worth now delving into what Chapter 4 of Pastor Aeternus means when it states, quote, "The definitions of the same Roman pontiff are irreformable of themselves and not from the consent of the Church." End quote. The Relatio is clear on this, stating, quote, "Finally, we do not separate the Pope, even minimally, from the consent of the Church, as long as that consent is not laid down as a condition which is either antecedent or consequent." End quote. And further, quote, "If these words of Christ are to have their necessary force, then it seems to me that one should conclude that the brothers, that is, the bishops, in order that they may be firm in the faith, need the aid and advice of Peter and his successors, and not vice versa." End quote. To put it more directly, the bishops rely on the infallibility and opinions of the Pope, not the Pope on the universal episcopate. Such a centralized act, such putting all one's eggs in a single basket, is how the Catholic Church has ended up in the situation it is now. Criticizing the view of the conciliarists and Gallicans, which states the Pope must have the consent of the bishops in order to issue dogmatic decrees, Gasser's Relatio states, quote, "As such, this type of necessity cannot have a place in the definition of a dogmatic constitution." End quote. He even differentiates how papal infallibility works differently from other modes of teaching that would require the assent of the episcopate. Quote, "It is true that the consent of the present preaching of the whole magisterium of the Church, united with its head, is a rule of faith even for the Church, is a rule of faith even for pontifical definitions. But from all that, it can in no way be deduced that there is a strict and absolute necessity of seeking that consent from the rulers of the Church or from the bishops." End quote. The Pope may, if he chooses, receive advice from others, but again, he is not obliged to, and the idea that he might be obliged to is seen as so dangerous that it simply cannot be inserted into the dogmatic decree. Quote, "It can happen that there be so difficult a case that the Pope think it necessary, for his own information, to ask the bishops, as an ordinary means, what the sense of the churches is, as he did, for example, in the case of the Immaculate Conception. Such a case, however, is not able to be established as a rule." End quote. So strong is this sentiment against the belief that the Pope must gain the consent of his brother bishops before binding the universal Church in matters of faith or morals, that the Relatio states, quote, "Therefore, whoever contends that the Pope, either for his information or for an infallible judgment about faith and morals, totally depends on the manifest consent of the bishops, or on their aid, has nothing left to do than to establish that false principle which says that all dogmatic judgments of the Roman pontiff are weak and reformable, in and of themselves, unless the consent of the Church accrues to them. but such an outlook is either completely arbitrary or subversive of all papal infallibility." End quote. Father O'Connor, whose translation and commentary we are using, steps in to make this even clearer by commenting on the 1682 Declaration of the French Clergy, stating, quote, "Declaration, following in tone some of the conciliarist decrees of the Council of Constance, especially the Sacrosancta of April 1415, held in its fourth article, to be cited by Gasser later in his Relatio, that the Pope has the chief role when it comes to matters of faith, but that nonetheless his decisions needed confirmation by the judgment of the entire Church. This position is, in essence, the thesis of Gallicanism, which, in one form or another, perdured into the 19th century, and which was ever in the background, and sometimes in the foreground, of the discussions on primacy and papal infallibility at Vatican Council I." End quote. Gallicanism, for those not aware, was at one time as much as 1/3 of the Catholic faithful as it was the official position of the French Church in both France and all its provinces. Its position was analogous to the Orthodox Christian position that the Pope's role was as head of the Synod, and not an infallible autocrat at his own will as the Catholic Church currently holds. But don't these categories apply only to those instances in which the Pope speaks ex cathedra? Not so. Albert Pigius was a Dutch theologian who died in 1542 and held to actual ultramontanism, that is, the belief that the Pope could not be heretical even in private, and therefore each of his statements was binding. Gasser responds to Pigius by quoting the Roman Catholic saint and doctor of the Church, Robert Bellarmine, a man who was as humorless and dull as he was a conciliarist. Father O'Connor explains this, saying, quote, "Albert Pigius is generally understood to have defended the thesis that the Pope, even as a private person, was incapable of falling into heresy. Using Robert Bellarmine as a source, Gasser maintains that this is a probable and pious opinion, but it is not that opinion that the draft proposes to define, since Gasser has been at pains to stress that the draft is treating the Pope in his role as a public person, supreme teacher of the Church, when he defines doctrines of faith or morals for the entire Church." End quote. So Pastor Aeternus does not set the maximum capabilities of the Pope as some such as Catholic Answers, Catholic Bridge, and lesser-known apologists like Erick Ybarra attempt to claim, but it is instead setting the minimum reaches of the Pope's capabilities. This is why the dogmatic constitution of the Church, Lumen Gentium, in its 25th chapter can affirm one must obey papal decrees even when not ex cathedra. Quote, "This religious submission of mind and will must be shown in a special way to the authentic magisterium of the Roman pontiff, even when he is not speaking ex cathedra. That is, it must be shown in such a way that his supreme magisterium is acknowledged with reverence, the judgments made by him are sincerely adhered to, according to his manifest mind and will. His mind and will in the matter may be known either from the character of the documents, from his frequent repetition of the same doctrine, or from his manner of speaking." End quote. In other words, even when the Pope is not speaking ex cathedra, you are bound to obey. Whether it is the so-called assent of mind and will, or the higher form, known as the assent of faith, is pointless, as one is bound, under pain of mortal sin, that is, a sin incurring damnation without repentance, for openly rejecting decrees requiring assent of mind and will. To put it bluntly, you can privately disagree, but you still must follow and obey while admitting the Catholic Church is correct on the matter. The only difference is in the first, that being assent of mind and will. You can withhold your assent as long as you admit it is a problem on your end and not with the Catholic Church. Taking all of this into consideration, one must ask themselves if this is reflected in the history of the tome. In 448 AD, a famous and aged archimandrite in Constantinople, named Eutyches, was brought before the Patriarch, St. Flavian, to answer the charge that he believed Christ was not consubstantial with humanity, but was purely divine. Eutyches, possibly going senile, strangely insisted that Christ was indeed consubstantial with his mother, and that his mother was indeed consubstantial with us, but that Christ was somehow not consubstantial with the rest of humanity. He was deposed, and immediately appealed to all of the major sees in Christendom, including Rome. Pope St. Leo, receiving the letter of Eutyches, letter 21 in the collection of St. Leo, wrote to St. Flavian, the Patriarch of Constantinople, requesting a dossier containing the details of the trial and commenting that Eutyches was probably suffering from old age. Now, per the canons of the Council of Sardica in 343, a deposed cleric could appeal to the Pope, and the Pope could determine whether or not that cleric deserved a retrial, but the retrial had to be composed of the bishops of a territory bordering that of the deposed clerics. In some cases, judges from Rome could join those bishops, but the role of the Pope was not as an appeals court at this point, but simply as a review court. It decided whether or not one could even receive a retrial. Hearing that Eutyches was writing to Rome, and assuming Eutyches would listen to Leo if he would not listen to the Patriarch himself, St. Flavian asked St. Leo to write a document explicating the doctrine under discussion, and Leo obliged. Letters 22, 23, 24, and 26 in the collection of St. Leo detail this further. St. Flavian writes, quote, "Therefore, most Holy Father, being stirred by all that he has ventured, and by what has been done, and is being done against us and the most Holy Church, use your accustomed promptitude as becomes the priesthood, and in defending the commonwealth and peace of the Holy Churches, consent by your own letter to endorse the resolution that has been canonically passed against him, and to confirm the faith of our most religious and Christ-loving Emperor. For the matter only requires your weight and support, which through your wisdom will at once bring about general peace and quietness. For thus both the heresy which has arisen and the disorder it has excited will easily be appeased by God's assistance through a letter from you, and the rumored synod will also be prevented, and so the most holy churches throughout the world need not be disturbed." End quote. So St. Flavian is not looking for a dogmatic decree, but, in his own words, a confirmation, an endorsement, and the weight and support of Leo. But the situation quickly boiled over because Eutyches was the godfather of the powerful court eunuch Chrysophius. In addition, Eutyches appealed to several sees, one of them being Alexandria, which had a long history of clashing with Constantinople. The Patriarch of Alexandria, Pope Dioscorus, immediately and foolishly took up the cause of Eutyches and made it a point of contention. Prior to this, Dioscorus, who had been the archdeacon of St. Cyril of Alexandria, had become convinced that St. Cyril had compromised the faith when he entered back into communion with the Antiochian party in 433 AD and accepted the validity of Diophysite or two-nature terminology. Patriarch Dioscorus, a socially retarded zealot with no class and none of the flexibility, pragmatism, or theological insights of his predecessor, St. Cyril, used this opportunity to assert Alexandrine hegemony over Constantinople. And furthermore, in collusion with Chrysophius, the court eunuch, Dioscorus pressured the weak-willed Emperor Theodosius II to summon an ecumenical council. To their surprise, the emperor was completely in favor and issued a summons directing bishops to arrive at the city of Ephesus in 449. For Theodosius II, he leapt at the opportunity to save face from the embarrassment he had incurred in 431. This council, unlike the previous Council of Ephesus, would not be run by the wily and politically well-connected St. Cyril, who had reposed 5 years earlier before in 444. The first Council of Ephesus had been opened, run, and closed contra the wishes of the emperor, who had called and bankrolled it, hoping it would create an equitable situation for Nestorius. In fact, the moment St. Cyril and Nestorius each stepped into the city, no one showed any interest in obeying the emperor's wishes. Not only did St. Cyril not wait for the Antiochian party, but he fooled the imperial official, Count Candidianus, into opening the council early, almost immediately called a vote to depose Nestorius, and then issued decrees without running them by imperial officials first. When the Antiochian party did arrive, roughly 2 weeks later, they set up a rival council and excommunicated Cyril, Memnon of Ephesus, and all the bishops who sided with them. Hearing word of it, the emperor ordered the city to be locked down and communication with the outside halted. The tenacious Cyril, though, never to be outdone, repeatedly attempted to send messages, and bribes, to the imperial court to sway court opinion to his side. After months of vacillating, and due largely to his overbearing older sister, St. Pulcheria, Theodosius II caved and sided with Cyril, who had broken his trust and manipulated his court against him. The emperor declared St. Cyril's theology as imperial policy and banished Constantinople's patriarch, Nestorius. As a side note, as one can see in this image, Mr. Ybarra has openly stated he, quote, sympathizes with Nestorius, end quote. One can only wonder why Mr. Ybarra sympathizes with one of the stodgiest, most arrogant and vain, as well as theologically clueless heretics the Church has ever known, and, if it might be added, one who had a full 20 years to repent before death, but did not because he still couldn't figure out what a hypostatic union is, but we will leave that up to Mr. Ybarra to explain in a debate, if he finally takes us up on our offer to him. But back to the First Council of Ephesus. This time, 18 years later, none of that would be allowed to occur. Attempting to master the humiliation that had occurred in 431, Theodosius called the council in the same location and again named the Pope of Alexandria as the presider, but the emperor insisted armed guards would patrol the proceedings and his orders would be enforced. Little did the emperor know, it would be even more chaotic and even more divisive than the First Council of Ephesus. Writing to this Second Council of Ephesus, Pope St. Leo states, quote, but because the healing even of such men must not be neglected, and the most Christian emperor has piously and devoutly desired a council of bishops to be held, that all error may be destroyed by a fuller judgment, I have sent our brothers Julius the bishop, Renatus the presbyter, and my son Hilary the deacon, and with them Dulcitius the notary, whose faith we have proved, to be present in my stead at your holy assembly, brethren, and settle in common with you what is in accordance with the Lord's will. End quote. When St. Leo wrote this, the tome had already been published some months before. Now, if the tome were ex-cathedra, it would be the definitive statement on dogma, and one must all but bow to it. But if that is the case, exactly how is Pope St. Leo speaking of a council as giving a, quote, fuller judgment, end quote, on the issue, and why is he saying he will, quote, settle in common, end quote, with the bishops present, quote, what is the Lord's will, end quote. According to Roman Catholic apologists, the tome had already settled the issue and given the final judgment. And it is easy to believe that, but only if one forgets that the tome was dated to June 449 and had been circulating since then. So by the time Chalcedon was convened in October 451, the tome was already approaching 2.5 years old. Not coming across as a particularly heavy-hitting piece of theology, and certainly having some odd wording at various points, the tome did not attract much attention. Previous to Ephesus 2, Dioscorus read it in private, and some of the more poorly worded lines in it garnered not only his shock, but the shock of many bishops, including many of those later on at Chalcedon. This is why Dioscorus received, but did not read the tome at the Second Council of Ephesus. At Ephesus 2, with 130 bishops in attendance, Eutyches gave a confession of faith good enough to convince Cyrillian bishops of his orthodoxy, and he was received back into communion. But what made the council so memorable was, despite not being called as a trial of other patriarchs, it suddenly became an impromptu court case against the patriarchs of Constantinople and Antioch and numerous of their bishops. It was during this point in the trial that chaos erupted, and the bishops present, riled up by Dioscorus, attacked the aged patriarch of Constantinople, St. Flavian, beating him so severely that he died shortly thereafter. The papal legates fled, but before exiting, one of them, in the name of the pope whom he represented, shouted, "Contradictor," or annulled, referring to the pope's final ratification being necessary for a council's validity in normal circumstances. The situation was dire, because the reunion of 433 AD had been revoked, the patriarch deposed and killed, the famed Theodoret of Syre, Patriarch Dominus of Antioch, Ibas of Edessa, Eusebius of Dorylaeum, and several other bishops had been deposed. Worse yet, the canonical legality of Ephesus II was questionable at best due to not only Rome, but also Antioch and Constantinople not signing on. But the emperor gleefully signed it into law, and then, by installing patriarchs in Antioch and Constantinople who were partisans of Dioscorus, they would sign on as well. Professor of Patristics and Byzantine History, Father John Anthony McGuckin, in his work, St. Cyril of Alexandria and the Christological Controversy, describes the situation at Ephesus too as follows, quote, Dioscorus, with the Emperor Theodosius' approval, supported Eutyches wholeheartedly, and after he had received an official appeal from the archimandrite, the prospects for any continuation of the fragile peace of Ephesus seemed very slight indeed. On March 30th, 449, Theodosius and Chrysophius set aside the legal condemnation of Eutyches and called for a full synodical review of the issue, back in the metropolis of Ephesus. So opened the Second Council of Ephesus in 449, under the presidency of Dioscorus. It was intended, from the beginning, to be a rerun of Ephesus 431, and Dioscorus' presidency made it a trial of Flavian, Theodoret, and Ibas, more than an examination of Eutyches, who, thus, had merely a symbolic role in the whole affair. At the council, Dioscorus restated Cyril's doctrine without the Antiochian concessions, and similarly abandoned all the lines of development drawn by Proclus and Leo. Eutyches was restored, and then the bloodletting began. Theodoret, Ibas of Edessa, and their patriarch Domnus of Antioch, for tolerating them, were all deposed. Flavian of Constantinople was also deposed along with Eusebius of Dorylaeum, who had first accused Eutyches. Dioscorus privately read Leo's tome, which had been sent to him as the council president, in the expectation that he would simply endorse and promulgate it, with a scandalized disbelief that soon turned to hostility. He did not condemn Leo out and out for political reasons, but cast aside the tome despite all the protests of the Roman delegation and refused to acknowledge its existence, let alone have it read at the council. He thus saved himself the embarrassment of having to censure the pope in synodical process at the same time as deposing two other patriarchs. The atmosphere at Ephesus was extremely tense. Dissenters were heavily repressed by the imperial troops sent to ensure uniformity under Dioscorus' direction. Soldiers armed with cudgels beat up several of the condemned bishops who carried on protesting, including Flavian of Constantinople. This time, Theodosius was determined that his second Ephesian council could follow his policy without demur. The soldiers did their job so well that Flavian died a few days later of the shock to his system, to the great scandal of the bishops, both present and afar. In his fury, on hearing the results of this synod, Pope Leo called it a den of thieves rather than a synod. Even so, for all Leo's objections, the council was vindicated and endorsed by the emperor. Theodosius, for once, had his face set on something. But the plans of men and their destinies do not always agree, and on the 28th of July, in 450, the imperial lord of the world fell from his horse and broke his neck. The head of the odious Chrysophius was impaled on a stake hardly before his master's body was cold, for thus the Augusta Pulcheria moved out from her enforced retirement with the connivance of the imperial chief of staff, Aspar. She assumed the absolute power in alliance with the popular general Marcian, whom she symbolically married and raised to the purple. Soon, the imperial couple reconvened an international synod to meet at the capital in the suburb of Chalcedon. It opened on the 8th of October, 451. End quote. Not only did St. Leo not desire a council at Ephesus in 449, but he loathed the idea of one at Chalcedon in 451. As far as Leo was concerned, the situation could be solved if bishops simply signed his tome. Leo was not a great theological thinker. In fact, most of the tome is just reworked passages from previous Latin theologians, most notably St. Augustine. But coming from the Roman aristocracy, he was a shrewd statesman and politician. With that mindset, he knew that another council where the situation could blow up once again would be counterproductive, and so he wrote repeated letters to the court at Constantinople, attempting to downplay the need for a council before he finally acquiesced to one, but insisted on it taking place in the West instead. Soon, he completely gave in and agreed to one in the East. This is detailed in letters 44, 54, 69, 70, 76, 77, 83, 90, and 95 of St. Leo. While negotiations for the council began, Leo made sure his tome was further circulated, hedging his bets that if it were signed by enough bishops and harmony restored through it, the planned council, where so much could go wrong, would be called off. As the bishops gathered at Nicaea prior to the council, Dioscorus, in retaliation for being removed from the diptychs in Rome by Pope St. Leo, issued an excommunication and deposition of Leo, making him a persona non grata within the Patriarchate of Alexandria. It is often erroneously believed Dioscorus had excommunicated Leo at Ephesus too, or shortly thereafter, but as Father Richard Price points out, quote, Dioscorus declared Leo excommunicate while the bishops were gathering at Nicaea, before the council moved to Chalcedon. Since Leo had excluded Dioscorus from the commemoration in the liturgy months earlier, this might seem a less than outrageous quid pro quo. One may surmise that it was stimulated by the exertion of pressure on the bishops assembled at Nicaea to sign Leo's tome. End quote. No other patriarchs joined in on the deposition, making it simply a local one and not binding upon the Church Universal. This was also a point of contention, as the head of a synod can only be deposed through the verdict of his synod. In this case, the patriarchs themselves, as we see later on at Constantinople II in 553 AD. Since only one patriarch had weighed in on the deposition, it was considered invalid and honored only by the diehard followers of Dioscorus. In October 451, in the suburb of Constantinople called Chalcedon, on the Asian side of the straits and across the water from the imperial city, the council commenced. The council was well attended and was the largest to date, with roughly 370 bishops and episcopal representatives signing its decrees in person. Including the several hundred accompanying clergy in attendance, the sessions could easily exceed 600 attendees, not including soldiers, imperial officials, and secretarial staff. The first session began with a reading and examination of the Acts of Ephesus II, and proceeded to a trial of Dioscorus and 5 other bishops by the imperial official who pronounced them deposed, with the caveat that such a sentence was dependent upon ratification by the emperor, but later clarified it was to be ratified by the bishops. These bishops were later restored in the 4th session, when they signed the tome. Further, the depositions of St. Flavian of Constantinople and Eusebius of Dorylaeum were overturned. In the 2nd session, the Creed of Nicaea, the Creed of Constantinople, the 2nd letter of St. Cyril to Nestorius, the reunion letter of 433 between St. Cyril and John of Antioch, and then finally the Tome of Leo, were read aloud. The tome comes at the end of these readings, the 4 already established documents, because it is being judged in light of them. Father Price notes, quote, the 2 councils of Ephesus of 431 and 449 had sought to confirm the faith by approving certain already existent documents and by condemning certain individuals. Therefore, the bishops assembled at Chalcedon would have expected to settle the doctrinal issue in the same 2 ways. In this case, by solemnly ratifying the Tome of Leo, which Marcion had from his accession treated as the key document in the controversy, and by disciplining Dioscorus and other opponents of Leo, end quote. By, quote, existent documents, end quote, Father Price is referring to the letters of St. Cyril, not to the creeds. This is why, after the tome, they shouted, quote, this is the faith of the fathers. This is the faith of the apostles. We all believe accordingly. We Orthodox believe accordingly. Anathema to him who does not believe accordingly. Peter has uttered this through Leo. The apostles taught accordingly. Leo taught piously and truly. Cyril taught accordingly. Eternal is the memory of Cyril. Leo and Cyril taught the same. Leo and Cyril taught accordingly. Anathema to him who does not believe accordingly. This is the true faith. We Orthodox think accordingly, end quote. Notice that whenever Leo is mentioned, he is mentioned in terms of agreeing with St. Cyril. Likewise, the statement, quote, Peter has uttered this through Leo, end quote, is a statement after the fact. In other words, they are expressing the idea that this has been judged to be correct, and it could only be correct because Peter has spoken through Leo, not that when Leo speaks on theology, it is automatically Peter. It is a statement reflecting the judgment the bishops had passed on the tome, that it accorded with apostolic preaching, and not a statement concerning papal infallibility. Such statements are fairly common throughout patristic literature in regards to anyone who has spoken or acted correctly concerning doctrine. As Father Price notes, quote, the session was largely taken up by the reading of a series of creedal and dogmatic documents, including the Tome of Leo. The supporters of Miaphysite, one nature, Christology, criticized certain of its statements, which its apologists defended by citing similar statements in Cyril of Alexandria, whose unique authority in Christology was taken for granted throughout the council. End quote. But what stands out is that during the reading of the tome, the Illyrian bishops, who were within Rome's patriarchal jurisdiction, and the Palestinian bishops interrupted the reading at several points, taking issue with some of Leo's odd wording. This forced the Archdeacon Aetius and Theodoret of Syr to offer replies and justify statements within Leo's tome from the writings of St. Cyril. Had the tome been ex-cathedra, this would have been unthinkable, as there would be no room to challenge something already dogmatic, as they would have all been expected to submit to it. One would be able to politely ask for clarifications, but to interrupt the reading of a decree holding dogmatic authority and demanding it be justified by another source would have been beyond crass. It would be subversive and heretical. But then we see this odd exchange wherein Atticus, the bishop of Nicopolis, asks for a pause of several days to analyze the tome and requests a copy of St. Cyril's third letter to Nestorius containing the 12 chapters with which to judge the tome. He states, quote, "Since your magnificence is showing readiness to listen with patience, order it to be granted to us that within a few days what is pleasing to God and to the Holy Fathers may be formulated with calm reflection and unruffled thought, since the letter of our Master and Holy Father and Archbishop Leo, who administers the Apostolic See, has now been read. We should also be provided with the letter of the blessed Cyril written to Nestorius, in which he urged him to assent to the 12 chapters, so that at the time of examination we may be found well prepared." End quote. The imperial officials grant this and reply, quote, "Your holinesses may meet in the residence of the most holy Archbishop Anatolius and deliberate together about the faith, so that the objectors may be instructed." End quote. Notice the word instructed as it comes up again. Quote, "The most magnificent and glorious officials and the exalted Senate said, 'It is not necessary for you all to meet, but since it is appropriate to convince all the objectors, let the most devout Archbishop Anatolius select from among the bishops who have signed those he considers competent to instruct the objectors." End quote. Catholic apologists latch onto the term instructed as if the tome, supposedly being ex cathedra, was above reproach and was there to teach the bishops what to believe. But that is not what is being said here. The instructed is not in reference to teaching disobedient or schismatic bishops by an infallible decree, but in regards to other bishops, explaining and clarifying the poorly worded sections of the tome so that those objecting bishops would ratify it. We know this because the officials say, quote, "It is appropriate to convince all the objectors," end quote. In other words, their cooperation was necessary. But why? The reason is because the tome was in the process of being ratified by the council, and while ignoring the protests of a small portion of some minor bishops is part and parcel of the conciliar model, leaving out 20% of the bishops present does not work with the conciliar model. This is why, as Father Price notes, quote, "The chairman now proposed a postponement of further discussion of the faith at a formal session of the council until Leo's supporters had provided further reassurance for the critics of the tome at a meeting to be held at the residence of the Archbishop of Constantinople." End quote. Session 3 consisted in the ecclesiastical trial of Dioscorus, in which the legates of Pope St. Leo the Great led the council fathers in excommunicating and deposing Dioscorus, and the bishops followed with a lengthy list of the signatures and statements ratifying the sentence passed by the papal legates. Mention of the tome is scant in Session 3, but by the 4th session, the bishops gathered to judge the tome. Father Price writes, quote, "The fathers of Chalcedon were profuse in their professions of loyalty to Cyril. Even when judging the tome of Pope Leo, the great Western Christological statement, formally approved at Chalcedon, their criterion of orthodoxy remained agreement with Cyril. This is clear throughout the lengthy discussion of the tome in the 4th session." End quote. Father Price follows this, stating, quote, "Nothing could be more indicative of the mood of the council than the fact that even Theodoret had to defend the tome by appealing to the authority of Cyril. His own attitude was far more critical. He had strongly attacked Cyril's 12 chapters back in the pamphlet war in early 431 and had been very reluctant to accept Nestorius' subsequent condemnation. But he clearly recognized that it would be disastrous to argue that there was something valuable in the Tome of Leo that was lacking in Cyril. Instead, he played along with the conviction of the majority that Cyril provided the yardstick of orthodoxy. End quote. First, Theodoret had to defend the tome. This immediately tells us that at least a sizable minority of the bishops present had not received this as an infallible statement they must submit to. Quite the contrary, they saw it as a document open for critique that needed their ratification. Second, the bishops were making sure to analyze it in light of the theological works of St. Cyril. Contrast this to what the clueless historical revisionism of the Relatio states, quote, "Can it really be said that the fathers at Chalcedon, before they hailed the tome of St. Leo to Flavian as having come from the mouth of Peter, anxiously inquired as to whether this tome adhered to the advice of the bishops? Even more, can it really be said that history, which tells us so many wonderful things about the origin of this tome, makes mention of the consent of the bishops, which preceded this dogmatic definition of the Roman pontiff?" End quote. Despite having written this, Gasser does not consider the tome as being ex-cathedra, and we will discuss that later in this video. It would be one thing if it came down to the bishops offering advice, but what the bishops were doing was far more invasive than that. They were putting it under scrutiny and stress, testing it for orthodoxy. In other words, they were putting what Catholic apologists would have us believe was supposedly an infallible statement, one guaranteed but Jesus Christ to be without mistake and completely flawless, under a stress test to see if it was dogmatically sound. But why would they do that if they considered it infallible? Why? Because they did not consider it infallible at all. Again, Father Price sheds light on this, stating, quote, "In all, despite the formal approval of the tome by the Eastern bishops, both before the council, at the council, and in the definition itself, it remained far less important for them than the conciliar letters of Cyril." End quote. In fact, the imperial commissioner, understanding the bishops at Chalcedon were judging the tome in light of St. Cyril, Constantinople I, and Nicaea, straight out asks the bishops, quote, "Since we see the divine gospels displayed by your devoutness, let each of the most devout bishops assembled state if the definition of the 318 fathers who met formerly at Nicaea and of the 150 who convened subsequently in the imperial city is in harmony with the letter of the most devout Archbishop Leo." End quote. What then follows is the statements of bishops stating they are ratifying the tome in light of its agreement with Nicaea, Constantinople, and even though the imperial commissioner had not mentioned it, Ephesus 1. The bishops themselves, though, feel the need to mention they are using the First Council of Ephesus to judge the tome. The first to sign is the Patriarch of Constantinople, Anatolius. He states, quote, "The letter of the most sacred and God-beloved Archbishop Leo accords with the creed of our 318 Holy Fathers at Nicaea and of the 150 who subsequently assembled at Constantinople and confirmed the same faith, and with the proceedings of the Ecumenical and Holy Council at Ephesus under the most blessed Cyril, now among the saints, when it deposed the infamous Nestorius. Therefore, I have both expressed agreement and signed willingly." End quote. This is followed immediately after by the papal legates themselves, quote, "The most devout bishops Pascasinus and Lucentius, and the most devout presbyter Boniface, representatives of the Apostolic See, said through the most devout Pascasinus, it is clear and cannot be disputed that the faith of the most blessed Pope of the Apostolic See, Archbishop Leo, is one and in accord with the creed of the 318 fathers who met at Nicaea, that it upholds both the creed of the 150 who convened at Constantinople, and also the decrees of Ephesus under Cyril of holy memory, when Nestorius was deposed on account of his errors. It differs from them in no way at all. Because of this, it has been demonstrated that the letter of the most blessed Pope, which renewed this faith because of the errors of Eutyches, accords with the same creed." having one and the same Spirit. End quote. Following Constantinople and the papal legates, the bishops sign in order of precedence, starting with Antioch. Quote, Maximus, the most devout bishop of Antioch in Syria, said, The letter of the most holy Leo, Archbishop of Imperial Rome, accords with the definitions of the 318 Holy Fathers at Nicaea, of the 150 at Constantinople, New Rome, and with the faith defined at Ephesus by the most holy Bishop Cyril, and I have subscribed. Stephen, the most devout bishop of Ephesus, said, The letter is in accord, and I have subscribed to it as being correct. Diogenes, the most devout bishop of Cyzicus, It is in accord, and I have signed it. Cyrus, the most devout bishop of Anazarbus, said, It is in accord, and I have signed it. Constantine, the most devout bishop of Bostra in Arabia, said, It is in accord, and I have signed it. John, the most devout bishop of Sebastia in Armenia Prima, said, According to my understanding, the meaning of the letter of the most holy Leo, Bishop of Rome, accords with the creed of the 318 and of the 150 who subsequently assembled at Constantinople, and with the decrees of Ephesus relating to the deposition of the impious Nestorius under the leadership of the most blessed Cyril, and I have subscribed to the same letter. Constantine, the most devout bishop of Melitene in Armenia Secunda, said, I am convinced that the letter of the most blessed and holy Pope Leo of Rome, which I have also signed, is in harmony with the definitions of the 318 Holy Fathers who assembled at Nicaea, of the 150 at Constantinople under Theodosius of divine memory, and of those at Ephesus under the most blessed Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria. Seleucus, the most devout bishop of Amasia, said, We have found that the conciliar letters of the most sacred Father Cyril are in harmony with the faith defined by the 318 Holy Fathers, and likewise we have found that the letter of the most holy Archbishop Leo accords with the 318 and the teaching of the most holy Cyril. Patricius, the most devout bishop of Tyana, said, We have found the letter of the most holy Leo, Archbishop of Rome, to be in harmony with the 318 at Nicaea and with the 150 Holy Fathers who subsequently met in the imperial city, and I have signed. Theodore, the most devout bishop of Damascus, said, There is no doubt that the letter of our most blessed and holy Father Archbishop Leo accords with the definition of the Holy Fathers at Nicaea, just as the letters of the most blessed Cyril accord with the same definition, and I have signed it. Photius, the most devout bishop of Tyre, said, We find harmony with the faith defined by the 318 Holy Fathers at Nicaea, in the 150 Holy Fathers who met at Constantinople, in those who subsequently assembled at Ephesus under the most blessed Cyril, and in the letter of our most holy and blessed Father Leo, Archbishop of Rome, and I have signed in my own hand. Simeon, the most devout bishop of Amida in Mesopotamia, said, The letter of Archbishop Leo of Rome is in harmony with the faith defined at Nicaea, with that of the 150, and with that defined at Ephesus under Cyril of blessed memory, and I have subscribed to it. Pergamius, the most devout bishop of Antioch in Pisidia, said, I recognize that the letter of the most sacred Leo, Archbishop of Rome, is in harmony and accord with the Catholic faith of the 318 and the 150 Holy Fathers, and also with that of those who met subsequently under the most blessed Cyril in the city of Ephesus, and I have subscribed to it. Theodore, the most devout bishop of Tarsus, said, We recognize that the letter of the most sacred Leo, Archbishop of Rome, agrees with the definition of faith of the 318 most holy bishops at Nicaea, with that of the 100 Holy Fathers who likewise met at Constantinople, and with that of those who met subsequently at Ephesus under the most blessed Cyril, and I have signed it. Francian, the most devout bishop of Philippopolis in Thrace, said, The letter of the most holy Archbishop Leo accords with the faith defined at Nicaea by the 318 Holy Fathers, with the council of the 150 Fathers that took place in imperial Constantinople, and with the council at Ephesus, which was led by the blessed Cyril, and I have signed it. And if there could then be any doubt about what the bishops were doing, we hear the following from Eusebius of Dorylaeum. Eusebius, the most devout bishop of Dorylaeum, said, I judge the letter of the most holy Leo, Archbishop of Senior Rome, to accord with the definition of the 318 Fathers who assembled at Nicaea, with the council of the 150 who assembled in the great city of Constantinople, and with the council that took place at Ephesus under the blessed Cyril, and I have signed it. The above is only the first 3 pages of signatures and statements like this in the Acts, but it is not the end. It goes on and on and on for almost 20 pages. This type of judgment would be truly astonishing had the tome been ex-cathedra. For example, imagine if the First Vatican Council began dissecting and debating if the ex-cathedra decree Ineffabilis Deus had taught correctly, which had declared the Immaculate Conception of Mary a dogma in 1854. Or better yet, if Vatican II had scrutinized and then ratified the other known ex-cathedra statement, Munificentissimus Deus, which declared the Assumption of Mary into heaven a dogma in 1950. Neither of those councils did that for the very simple reason that both of those councils recognized those 2 statements as ex-cathedra, and therefore closed to debate, closed to ratification, and most certainly closed to discussion. They were to be accepted as dogma upon being issued. Period. This was not the case with the tome, which after being issued for almost 2.5 years prior to Chalcedon, was being debated and scrutinized at Chalcedon. But one Catholic apologist in particular, Mr. Erick Ybarra, alleges the bishops did not want to judge the tome, but that they were forced into reading from a script. Erick Ybarra states,
"The Council of Chalcedon did not critically examine the Tome of Leo. Most of the bishops had already agreed with the tome before the council even began. So even if they agreed with the tome because they thought it was orthodox and not because of who Leo was, that would still make my article pertinent, which is, did the Council of Chalcedon critically examine the tome? The answer to that question is mostly no, because most of the bishops already agreed with it. There was a small minority who were, had problems with it. And the council, for the most part, wanted these men to just finally get it. They just wanted it to click. In the 4th session, we have some Orthodox critics that will point to the 4th session of Chalcedon, where you have all the bishops saying, I sign with my signature that the Tome of Leo is in harmony with the Creed of Nicaea, with the writings of Cyril, and with the holy, the holy faith at Constantinople I. But it should be recognized that the bishops didn't do that voluntarily. None of the bishops volunteered for that. The Imperial Commission at the council required the bishops to get up and acclaim whether Leo's tome was harmonious with Nicaea and Cyril. So it would kind of be like if you were at court and somebody gave you a pre-written statement where I, such and such, believe XYZ, and everybody has to come up one by one to say it. That's what basically happened there at the council. So a lot of people are reading into that something that wasn't there. That they're all of a sudden realizing that Leo's tome, it has to be judged by the standard of Nicaea and Cyril. But even if that was the case, that's really no problem, because in Catholic theology, Nicaea and the Cyrillian Christology, that was dogmatic in Rome. So there really is no issue there either.
We have examples from the 2nd and 3rd sessions, prior to the tome being officially voted on in the 4th session, where the bishops are insisting on shouting out random exclamations as to the validity or invalidity of the tome in light of previous doctrinal statements. So by the 4th session, the imperial commissioner, who is acting as a master of ceremonies, is simply asking them to do what they had been doing, but in an organized fashion, so he could take record of it and add it into the Acts. There is nothing odd about this, because the various chairmen of each session follow the same pattern with almost every decision in the council, from the deposition of Dioscorus, the reinstatement of Ibas, the passing of Canon 28, etc. This was the standard pattern in how conciliar sessions were managed, and were they not, it would have been utter mayhem. But were they given pre-written statements, as Mr. Ybarra alleges? Having just heard the first 3 pages of signatures at the end of the 4th session, one can see how ludicrous and uninformed, if not outright dishonest, his statement is, because the statements are highly varied, with some only a few words, while others are paragraphs long and they appear spontaneous, with only the shortest statements being identical. From this, we can see the Council Fathers did indeed judge the tome, and this rules out the tome being an ex-cathedra statement. So what was it? The tome was originally a letter written to St. Flavian of Antioch. Just like the second letter of St. Cyril to Nestorius, it was a pre-existing document whose author believed it to correctly expound the faith, and therefore submitted it to the council for ratification to make it universally binding. In fact, during the Third Ecumenical Council, that of Ephesus 431, we see this in the first session held on June 22nd, when the bishops go through the same type of ratification process for the second letter of St. Cyril to Nestorius as they did for the tome. From the first session of Ephesus 1, quote, "After the letter had been read, Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria, said, 'The Holy and Great Council has heard what I sent to the most devout Nestorius in defense of the Orthodox faith. I am confident that I shall be found to have departed in no way from the Orthodox account of the faith, or to have offended against the symbol issued by the Holy and Great Council convened in its time at Nicaea. And I ask your sacredness to say whether this writing of mine is orthodox, unimpeachable, and in accord with that Holy Council or not.'" Juvenal, Bishop of Jerusalem, said, "Now that the Holy Creed issued at Nicaea and the letter of the most holy and most sacred Archbishop Cyril have been read, the teaching of the Holy Council has been found to be in accord with that of Cyril, and, in addition, I agree and assent to these pious doctrines." Firmus, Bishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia, said, "What was said in brief and in summary by the Holy Council at Nicaea has been expounded with subtlety and exactitude by your religiousness, who has made the meaning of the creed clearer to us, with the result that there is no ambiguity in the things said, since they all cohere together and confirm the faith. Since, therefore, they are precise and irrefutable and introduce no innovation, I too give my assent, since I inherited the same convictions from my fathers, the holy bishops." Memnon, Bishop of the metropolis of Ephesus, said, "The contents of the letter of the most holy and most God-beloved Father and Bishop Cyril are in accord with the creed issued by the 318 holy fathers who met at Nicaea. We agree and assent to them, since we find nothing that is defective or dissonant." Theodosius, Bishop of Ancyra, said, "The exposition of the holy faith made by the 318 holy fathers convened at Nicaea is wonderful and most pious and orthodox, and has been shown clearly and plainly by the letter of the most religious and most holy Father and Bishop Cyril, which differs in no way from the teaching of that creed, but expounds more fully what is said there in summary. Therefore, since we recognize the accord between the letter and the creed of the 318 holy fathers, we agree and assent both to the latter and to our Father, who propounded their teaching in a letter, and we believe what they expounded and the letter of the aforementioned most holy Bishop Cyril clearly explained." Flavian, Bishop of Philippi, said, "Now that the creed issued at Nicaea by the 318 holy fathers, convoked in that city, has been read to us, and the letter of the most holy Father and Bishop Cyril, written to the most devout Nestorius about the faith, has also been read out, we find that it agrees clearly and expressly with the creed issued at Nicaea and provides much light for the understanding of what was affirmed. Therefore, I too assent to the letter written by the most holy and most God-beloved Father and fellow minister Cyril, which differ in no way from the Orthodox faith, but is in accord with the apostolic preaching and the Orthodox creed issued by the Holy Fathers at Nicaea. I testify that our most holy Father Rufus of the metropolis of Thessalonica assents to this, for these are the instructions that he gave me when I was to come to this great and holy council, when he himself declined to come for reasons of ill health. I am confident that all of those at Illyricum share my convictions and are in no doubt about what has been read." End quote. Notice how they follow the same pattern and language, despite one document supposedly being ex cathedra, while the other one is simply being ratified by a council. But one might attempt to get around this by claiming the bishops are merely testifying to their own orthodoxy by ratifying the second letter of Cyril to Nestorius. But that is not how St. Cyril frames the question. He asks them to openly testify to its orthodoxy when he says, quote, I ask your sacredness to say whether this writing of mine is orthodox, unimpeachable, and in accord with that holy council or not, end quote. One might also object by claiming the second letter of St. Cyril to Nestorius had been approved by Rome. That argument does not hold up because though we know Pope St. Celestine read not only the second letter of St. Cyril to Nestorius, but also the first and several other letters of Cyril to others, St. Celestine never specifies any document as being ratified by Rome. Instead, he simply states Rome approves of St. Cyril's faith. It is the fact that Rome never pointed to any specific document written by St. Cyril as a standard that caused the loophole allowing St. Cyril to insert his 12 anathemas into the third letter to Nestorius without Rome's prior knowledge, and then use them as one of the standards to condemn the Patriarch of Constantinople. Had Rome officially approved of any of St. Cyril's letters as some sort of infallible creed prior to Ephesus, the 12 anathemas would have been not only superfluous, but an inappropriate intrusion. But one might try to argue the Eastern bishops did not see it as ex cathedra, and that Leo did. To this, we direct the listener to letter 120 in the collection of letters by St. Leo. Writing to Theodoret of Syr, St. Leo states, quote, For in the letter which we issued from the Apostolic See, and which has been ratified by the assent of the entire Holy Synod, we know that so many divinely authorized witnesses are brought together that no one can entertain any further doubt except one who prefers to enwrap himself in the clouds of error. End quote. His main proof of its soundness in doctrine is the number of bishops who ratified it and their supposed unanimity. So even Pope Leo himself testifies that the tome was ratified by the council. Since when are ex cathedra statements ratified by councils? Never. Not even once. But in the same letter, Leo goes even further, stating to Theodoret that Christ, quote, has corroborated by the irrevocable assent of the whole brotherhood what he had already laid down through our ministry, to show that what had first been formulated by the foremost see of Christendom and then received by the judgment of the whole Christian world had truly proceeded from himself, that in this, too, the members may be at one with the head, for lest the assent of other sees to that which the Lord of all has appointed to take precedence of the rest might seem mere complacence, or lest any other evil suspicion might creep in, some were found to dispute our decisions before they were finally accepted. And the result of a discussion contributes to the greater glory of God when the debaters exert themselves with confidence in overcoming the gainsayers, that what of itself is shown wrong may not seem to be passed over in prejudicial silence. End quote. So here we have Pope St. Leo speaking of how the tome was, quote, received by the judgment, end quote, of the world's episcopate, that they assented to it, that there was debate, and that the council finally accepted it. This would not happen had the tome been ex cathedra, as such a document would be off limits to judgment, debate, and acceptance by a council. Had the tome been ex cathedra, it would have only to be submitted to. Questions and clarifications could have been asked, but debates on the content and passing judgment would have been sacrilege. Contrast that with Bishop Gasser's relatio, quote, that the infallibility granted to Peter was to have passed to his successors is also proved, in use the words of Cardinal Cayetan, from the fact that when the Pope makes a judicial and definitive decision determining that something is heresy, and that it must be held as such by the Church, then it is clear that we are all bound to accept his decision, and that whoever pertinaciously clings to the opposite view is considered a heretic. End quote. But in Chalcedon, we see the council debating the merits of the tome. In fact, we actually have a much later example of a pope laying out exactly why the type of proceedings at Chalcedon rules out the tome being an ex cathedra statement. This particular letter is written by Pope Clement IV to the Byzantine Emperor Michael Pelagius on the topic of the proposed Council of Lyon held in 1274 AD, and is quoted by Bishop Gasser in the Relatio to prove papal decisions are not up for discussion, debate, or ratification. In this letter, Pope Clement IV explains why he rejects the demand of the Byzantine Emperor for a council to ratify the decisions of a proposed council at Lyon. Pope Clement IV writes, quote, "Indeed, the prescribed truth of the Orthodox faith is pure, certain, and solid, and consonant with the teaching of the gospel, and it has been affirmed by the Holy Fathers and by the definition of the Roman pontiffs in their synods. Since it is not fitting, we do not want to submit this matter to new discussions or definitions as if, by such discussions, we were calling into doubt this truth in any way, thereby going against what is right and permitted. And therefore, although in what you have written you treat the convocation of a council and, through said letters, ask that a council be convoked in your land, we, nevertheless, have no intention of calling a council for a discussion or definition of this type. This decision does not mean that we fear any man, nor that we fear the Roman Church will be overcome by the prudence of the Greeks, but because it would be completely unfitting. What is more, even non-necessary and illegal, to call into doubt the prescribed purity of the true faith, affirmed by so many authorities on Scripture, fortified by the opinions of so many holy men, and by the firm definition of the Roman pontiffs. For the defense of his truth, if it were necessary, we ought to be ready to undergo martyrdom and even give our body to be exposed to death." End quote. From the example above, as well as how other documents were received in other ecumenical councils, it is clear that the tome's reception followed the same pattern of introduction, vote, and ratification, and is therefore not an ex-cathedra statement. It is for that reason Father Price can state Leo was only, quote, recommending, end quote, the tome to the Council of Ephesus II in 449, as he could not force it on them. Quote, "In this letter, he, Leo, instructed the bishops to reaffirm the condemnation of Nestorius at the Council of Ephesus of 431, and recommended his own tome as providing the solution to the more recent doctrinal controversy." End quote. One does not recommend an infallible statement. So no, Father Price, the translator and commentator on the only English edition of the Acts of Chalcedon, does not see the tome as ex-cathedra, nor does he believe Leo saw it as such. Likewise, Father Price does not deny Chalcedon critically examined the tome. He states, quote, "The fathers of Chalcedon were profuse in their professions of loyalty to Cyril. Even when judging the tome of Pope Leo, the great Western Christological statement, formally approved at Chalcedon, their criterion of orthodoxy remained in agreement with Cyril. This is clear throughout the lengthy discussion of the tome in the fourth session." End quote. He speaks of this not in terms of an insignificant minority doing the judging, but as the collective whole in council, identifying them simply as the Fathers of Chalcedon. Not a minority of fathers, not some, but instead simply the Fathers of Chalcedon. But the minority that had issues with the tome was not small. It was fairly significant, and if the lists of signatures in the Acts are to be trusted, which they should be, lest we undermine the reliability of the Acts en toto, that minority was at about 20% of bishops who took issue with it, including many bishops under Rome from the Illyrian coast. Further, those 20% of bishops had problems with it after critically examining it. It is not that only 20% critically examined it, it is that after all of the bishops critically examined it, 1/5 of them still had issues with it and required further information to properly pass judgment upon it. Despite that, after a minority of bishops hold a private meeting to study the tome further, and with explanations and assurances provided by other council members that it did agree with St. Cyril's second letter to Nestorius, the bishops gather for session 4, and if the Acts are to be trusted, the session is short and flows smoothly. But why is it short and flowing, essentially bereft of interruptions and distractions? Because, as mentioned previously, the tome had been available for nearly 2.5 years during that period. Most of the bishops present at Chalcedon had already scrutinized it and then signed it in the months prior to Chalcedon, after comparing it with the writings of St. Cyril. Father Price makes this abundantly clear in several places in his commentary. For the sake of time, the following 4 commentaries will suffice. Quote, in fact, the emperor's agents were active in securing subscriptions to the tome from as many bishops as possible in the regions dependent on Constantinople and Antioch, as is mentioned in a letter of Leo's, document 9. Already on the 21st of October, Anatolius had held a synod at Constantinople at which he and his bishops signed the tome and were formally restored to communion with the Roman See. End quote. Quote, when Theodosius II died suddenly in the summer of 450, the court of Constantinople immediately reversed its ecclesiastical policy. Eutyches was subjected to restraint, and the bishops were pressed to sign Leo's tome as the only way to restore ecclesiastical communion with the West. End quote. Quote, Anatolius of Constantinople had begun collecting signatures to the tome well before the council, documents before the Council 9. We may presume that the bishops waiting at Nicaea before the council opened will have been pressed for their signatures. In the 4th session, a great number of bishops reported that they had already signed. End quote. Quote, Anatolius of Constantinople and Maximus of Antioch, in accordance with the policy of the new government, were active and thorough in collecting signatures from the bishops under their authority. End quote. Another objection brought up by Catholic apologists is that Pope St. Leo believed his tome had settled the matter and a council was not required. That statement is true, but their interpretation of it is incorrect. But does that mean Leo thought his tome was ex-cathedra? No, of course not. Every bishop, even the theologically illiterate like Nestorius, believes the treatises on theology they compose to be free from error and a summary job of clarifying the faith. If they did not think that, they would not be publishing it. For example, St. Cyril did not need St. Celestine to tell him his first and second letters to Nestorius were error-free. That is why he was comfortable sending them to Nestorius before ever sending them to Rome. Nor did he need the Pope to tell him that the 12 anathemas were error-free or that they were therefore binding upon the faithful. That is one of the reasons why he was fine using them as an ultimatum to Nestorius without Rome's preview or knowledge, and why St. Cyril had no issue insisting anyone who wanted communion with him accept those 12 anathemas. Rome found out about those much later on. So Leo thinking the tome solved the problem is in line with St. Cyril thinking the 12 anathemas solved the problem. But after Ephesus II, bishops were signing the tome en masse and repenting of their actions at said council with those deposed in 449 AD, being largely readmitted to their sees by the emperor. As far as St. Leo could see, the issue was settled not by issuing the tome, but by the signing of the tome, and therefore, calling of a council was not simply going overboard, but would be opening the door to another explosive situation. But once a council was called, what would have happened had the bishops not ratified the tome? We know because we saw what happened after Ephesus II. Leo could not foist the tome upon the council, but he could refuse to keep communion with anyone who would not agree with the tome, just as St. Cyril refused communion with anyone who rejected the 12 anathemas. Father Price backs this up when he writes, quote, on the accession of Marcion and Pulcheria, Pope Leo demanded adhesion to the tome by each of the Eastern bishops as a condition for restoration of communion with him, broken as a result of the Council of Ephesus of 449. End quote. This brings up the question of whether or not those bishops felt they were outside the church because they lacked communion with Rome. If they did feel that way, they never let on. In fact, had they felt that way, would they have subjected the tome to such scrutiny? Of course not. But that is because they did not understand the church to be comprised of essentially just the Pope himself, which is what the current Roman Catholic ecclesiology results in. Another objection brought up by Catholic apologists is the final letter of the Council of Chalcedon to Pope St. Leo. In it, the bishop states, quote, and this golden chain leading down from the author of the command to us, you yourself have steadfastly preserved, being set as the mouthpiece unto all of the blessed Peter, and imparting the blessedness of his faith unto all. Whence we too, wisely taking you as our guide in all that is good, have shown to the sons of the church their inheritance of truth, not giving our instruction each singly and in secret, but making known our confession of the faith in conceit, with one consent and agreement. And we were all delighted, reveling, as an imperial banquet, in the spiritual food which Christ supplied to us through your letter. And we seemed to see the heavenly bridegroom actually present with us. For if where 2 or 3 are gathered together in his name, he has said, there he is in the midst of them. Must he not have been much more particularly present with 520 priests, who preferred the spread of knowledge concerning him to their country and their ease? Of whom you were chief, as the head to the members, showing your goodwill in the person of those who represented you. End quote. Supposedly, because the bishops describe St. Leo as mouthpiece of St. Peter, as imparting the faith to all, and that the tome was spiritual food that Christ supplied through the tome, the bishops thought the tome was ex-cathedra. First, as has already been demonstrated, the tome was heavily argued and debated over, which would be a non-starter for an ex-cathedra decree. So this is not what the bishops are talking about. Second, the bishops locate the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and therefore the correctness of their decision, not in the tome coming from Rome, but in the number of their gathering who approved it. They state, quote, "For if where 2 or 3 are gathered together in his name, he has said that there he is in the midst of them. Must he not have been much more particularly present with 520 priests?" End quote. Even more so, they then back up their decision regarding the definition of faith they produced, not as having been approved by the Roman legates, nor as being consonant with the tome, which had been judged in comparison to St. Cyril's second letter to Nestorius, but by a miracle of St. Euphemia. They say, quote, "For it was God who worked, and the triumphant Euphemia, who crowned the meeting as for a bridal, and who, taking our definition of the faith as her own confession, presented it to her bridegroom by our most religious emperor and Christ-loving empress, appeasing all the tumult of opponents and establishing our confession of the truth as acceptable to him, and with hand and tongue setting her seal to the votes of us all in proclamation thereof." End quote. For those not familiar with the miracle of the martyr of St. Euphemia, the story is as follows. St. Euphemia's relics were kept in Chalcedon, and after intense debate, the council wrote a definition of faith while the partisans of Dioscorus of Alexandria wrote their own definition of faith. It was agreed between them that the 2 definitions would be placed into the sarcophagus of the great saint and martyr who had suffered under Diocletian in 303 AD. The imperial seal was placed on the sarcophagus, and guards were set while the bishops spent the following 3 days fasting and praying for guidance. After that period was over, the sarcophagus was opened before all of the witnesses, and as you can see in her icon, while the definition of the partisans of Dioscorus was at the feet of the great saint, the definition of the Council of Chalcedon was held tightly in her hands. We will end this video as we began it, with the relatio of Bishop Gasser. Earlier in the video, it had been pointed out that Bishop Gasser, the man tasked with composing the official interpretation of Chapter 4 of Pastor Aeternus, did not think the tome was infallible. In fact, lacking examples of the Pope having spoken ex cathedra, Gasser's relatio gives 3 examples he believes are the strongest testimonies to the Church believing in the infallibility of the Pope. 1 example from the first millennium, and 2 from the second millennium, and the tome is not the one he chooses from the first millennium. Instead, he chooses the libellus presented to the Byzantines at the Council of Constantinople in 869 AD, not the original libellus of Hormisdas from the early 6th century, but the altered version of the libellus of Hormisdas used by Rome at Constantinople 869. He believes this is the strongest, albeit indirect, testimony in the first millennium. It must be stressed that Bishop Gasser does not consider them or any of the classic proof text for papal infallibility from saints such as Irenaeus, Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, etc., as direct testimony, but instead describes them as indirect testimonies. Father O'Connor the English translator and commentator on Gasser's Relatio, states, quote, "The patristic texts adduced by Bishop Gasser can hardly be taken as clear indication of their author's belief in the infallibility of the Pope as Vatican Council I was going to define it. Gasser himself has indicated that the statements of the Fathers which he has brought forth fall under the category of indirect testimony, a testimony which gives evidence of a, quote, rule of faith, end quote, which existed for the writers of the ancient church. This rule of faith was essentially this: unity with the See of Peter was the most certain guarantee available that one was walking in the way of the true faith, end quote. Gasser's other two examples of indirect testimonies are the definitions at the Council of Lyon in 1274 and the Council of Florence in 1439. Gasser also considers these only indirect testimony and not actual examples of papal infallibility, despite arguing the definition from Florence draws directly from the letter of Pope St. Agatho to the Council of Constantinople III, a document Catholic apologists erroneously argue claims infallibility. That one, Gasser believes, does not make the cut for ex-cathedra. In short, the man so well versed in theology he was handpicked by the Pope to write the official interpretation of Pastor Eternus did not think the Tome of Pope St. Leo, the Libellus of Hormisdas, the letter of Agatho to the Council of Constantinople III, or any of the classic proof texts argued by Catholic apologists were examples of papal infallibility or even direct testimonies to it. In this sense, Gasser actually agrees somewhat with orthodoxy and modern scholarship. Despite moments of honesty, Gasser is trapped within his own worldview, and in a stunning display of circular reasoning, the Relatio explains why the episcopate is always united on an ex-cathedra statement, quote, "We are not able to separate the Pope from the consent of the Church because this consent is never able to be lacking to him. Indeed, since we believe that the Pope is infallible through the divine assistance, by that very fact we also believe that the assent of the Church will not be lacking his definitions, since it is not able to happen that the body of bishops be separated from its head, and since the Church Universal is not able to fail." End quote. In other words, because the bishops have no choice but to obey the infallible Pope, they will give their consent. What this reveals is that in the mind of Vatican I, the Catholic Church consists essentially of the papacy, everything else being merely additional. This is probably why Father O'Connor states, quote, "In light of what he will proceed to say about papal infallibility not requiring any juridical consent or assent of the Church Universal, Gasser's argument may appear incongruent or even amazing." End quote. His arguments don't just appear incongruent, but actually are incongruent because he is attempting to fit a round peg into a square hole. So can the Tome of Leo be considered ex cathedra? The evidence definitely speaks against it, and for the most part, so does the second millennium tradition of the Catholic Church. We want to thank you for listening and subscribing to us here at Ubi Petrus. These videos take a significant amount of time and effort, as well as materials to research and produce them. Your contributions make it possible to create more of this great content and for us to release them on a more frequent schedule.